Today's daf is daf Ayin Aleph. Hamoras das poselis. That means that im nishtamed, he became a shmad, v'snaku masav lov shabashmayim lo yochal bepesach. Yein hamoras das poselis betruma b'maser, and Tosfos points out that b'maschil v'ein, that in Masechet Pesachim, the Girsa is Ein Hamaras Das Poselis B'Truma, and the miyud of bo applies to both. That only Hamaras Das Poselis B'Achilas Pesach, Lo B'Dvarim Acherim, L'mayit, to exclusion of both Truma and Maser. And those point out, if not for the miyud, we would have learned the Isur Truma with Exer Shava Toshav V'Socher from Pesach, and we'd have said that Hamaras Das Poselis even in Truma, and the same thing with regard to Maser, we would have derived it from Exer Shava Mimenu Mimenu. The Gemara adds to clarify what is the miyud of the psukim of bo. What do we exclude from bo? The Gemara asks, V'chol ara lo yochel bo, and that's the pasuk by Pesach. And what is the bo lomali coming to exclude? And the Gemara answers, bo, meaning b'korban Pesach atzmo, orel, eno ochel. Aval ochel hu, the orel could eat b'matzah u b'moror. And the chiddush is that an orel is chayav to eat matzah u moror, even though he's possible to eat korban Pesach. And matzah u moror is a separate chiyuv, a separate mitzvah. We don't need a chiddush to be matir achilas matzah and more for an oil, because there's no kedusha to matzah or more. Now, once the Gemara brings the psukim by Pesach that teach me about orel and mumar, that they don't eat the korban Pesach, the Gemara clarifies, why do I need two psukim, one for orel and one for mumar? Why can't we derive one from the other? The itzrich lemichtav orel, the itzrich lemichtav kol ben nechar. I'm not sure I understand why the Gemara compares these two. In other words, when the Torah says that an oral doesn't eat Pesach, says that a ben nechar doesn't eat, a mumar doesn't eat Pesach, these are two different dinim. But for some reason, the Gemara thinks that or in the Havmina, they should be one din that could be derived one from the other. If we exclude orel from korban Pesach, is mishum demois. The orel itself is me'usahi. And this is a Mishnah Masechet Nedarim Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, me'usahi ha'orla. Sheniskanu ba harishon shenemar ki kol hagoyim arelu. So the Torah excludes an oral from korban Pesach because of orla me'usahi. Aval ben nechar delo mois. He doesn't have orla, therefore we wouldn't put him in the category of mois. Emo lo. This Gemara has to be understood on a deeper level. I would have thought that ben nechar is allowed to eat from the korban Pesach. Therefore, the Torah to say explicitly called ben nechar lo yochel bo, to teach us that a mumar, even though he's not mos, cannot eat from the korban Pesach, because Rachmana called ben nechar. If we only had the pasuk called ben nechar lo yochel bo, we would have said that only a mumar is the Torah saying and he can't eat the Pesach mishum the ein libo l'shamayim. In other words, he's not in any way experiencing Achilas HaPesach as a religious experience. I mean, ein libo l'shamayim, aval orel libo l'shamayim. Okay, he couldn't circumcise himself for whatever reason, but libo is l'shamayim. His aim low, I would think that he's not prohibited from eating the Pesach, and therefore tzricha need two mi'ut. Now the Gemara continues to clarify, what do we derive from the pasuk mimenu? Because now that we've interpreted the pasuk bo, that bo comes to teach me, whatever it teaches me, then Let's also interpret the word mimenu that it comes to teach. Right? So it's al tochlu mimenu. With regard to Parapes al tochlu mimenu no ubashel bevuchel b'mayim, and the possible so suru mimenu ad poker. Again, the word mimenu in the same pasuk it says v'anos mimenu ad poker bo'esh tisrofu lamali. What is the mimenu? And the Gemara answers Kidarabba. L'Chidarabba, the Omer Rabbi Yitzchak, that Rabbi Rabbah says in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, and that we're going to see later on Daf Hayidalad, what exactly we darshan from the word Mimenu. Omar Mar. We had a Bryce on Daf Ayin. Rabbi Akiva Omer Einot Sok. We don't need the Gzeir Shav Toshav Sok there from Pesach, and we could derive that an Orel cannot eat Truma from the pasuk in the din of Truma itself. Omer ish mizera Aaron v'hu tzaru ozah b'kodshim lo yochal. And what's the double language ish? The rabos es ha'orel. That just like Terua Ozav is excluded from Truma, and he has the same, so too Orel is excluded from Truma, just like a Tome. In other words, the Ish is telling you not only is a Tome excluded from Truma, but also an Orel who has a din similar to a Tome, because he's mentioned in the same pasuk, he doesn't eat Truma. So the Gemara asks Ema, and how do you know that when the Torah with the ribuy of Ish is coming to exclude an Orel, why can't we suggest an alternative, Rabos Esa Onen? Maybe the Torah is excluding an Onen from eating Truma like a Tamid. But an Orel Enochinami could eat Truma. Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Penina, Amar Kra, it says with regard to Bechol Zar, and that's going to be a mute, which means that Soros, someone who's with a Kohen, I told you that he doesn't eat Truma because the pasuk says Yochal Kodesh. Below Aninus, but to be Memayit Aninus. And this limud of Vechol Zar Velo Aninus is coming to exclude a possible derivation from Ish to include Onen in the Isa Achilas Truvas. Whereas, but Ema, maybe when the Torah says Zar, to exclude someone who's not a Zar, perhaps maybe exclude an Orel. And why did you derive from this, from the pasuk that an Orel cannot eat Truma? Maybe from V'chol Zar, we're going to derive the conclusion that an Orel can eat Truma. Instead, you're deriving a conclusion that an Onen is allowed to eat Truma. Maybe substitute Orel for Onen. And my answer is no, it's impossible to say that V'chol Zar is coming to exclude an Orel that he's not included in the Isa Achilas Truma. He's allowed to eat Truma because Haksiv Ish. And Ish is a ribuy to tell me that an Orel has the same status as the Tamid. He's enjoined from eating Truma. So Gemara Sumara Isa. What's the compelling logic to assume that Ish is coming to be marva, that an Orel has the same status as a Tamid, excluded from Truma, and the pasuk called Sar, which is coming to be might Onen, that he's not included in the Isra Achila. Why not say just the opposite? Ish is coming to be marba, that an Onen is not allowed to eat Truma. He's got the same status. And the pasuk called Zar is coming to be Mamait Orel, that he's not included in the Isra Achila. And the Gemara says, Mistabra Arelus is more Chomor, Havi Leila Rebuye, including him in the Isra Truma under Ish. And what is Chuma? And here the Gemara gives like a mnemonic device: Masim, Krusim, Bidovar, Ha'eved. And this is a siman for the Chumros that exist or apply to Arlus and do not apply to Anis. What do these words symbolize? So we'll start with the word Masim. And that's Mechusar Maisa, that Orel is missing the action of Mila. That itself is a chumrah. Why isn't he involved in a mice? He non-fulfilled, non-compliance, which we don't find in Aninus. And not only that, but included under the siman of masim, we have, in plural it says masim, is masa mila begufa. It's a mila in the goof of the oral. So, I mean, the oral is missing something that is goof. That's a chumrah. Then we have krusim, and that means onush kares. If he doesn't circumcise himself, he's chayav kares. And then what is bidavar? The yeshno lifnei adivu. And the mitzvah of Mila was given already to Avram Avinu before Matan Torah. Next we have ha'eved. What's ha'eved? The Orla is chamura, even Milas zechar v'avod of Makevs. If he has a son or an eved and they're obligated to Mila, then he, the father or the master of the eved, the owner of the eved, is not allowed to eat from Pesach until he fulfills his obligation to circumcise them. And these are all chumras that are unique to Arlus as opposed to Aninus. So therefore it's more logical to assume that the ish, which is coming to include X in the Isser Arla, the Isser Achilus Pesach Arla, is coming to include the RL, that he should not, just a second, ish mizera and tzarua in Truma, my mistake, right? That the ish is coming to be marba, and an oral is like a tome with regard to achilas truma, and the oral is excluded from achilas truma. And the chol zar is telling you that an onain can eat truma, but the Gemara's adarab aninas havile rabuye. There are a number of chumras that we find in onain that don't exist in oral. Kenyishna the chol shah. Right, at any moment you could become an onain, so it's something that repeats itself. And v'noheges bein banosh bein b'noshim, as opposed to orlus, which is only in males, the ninus category applies even to females. V'ein b'yodel sakin atzmo, and it's out of his control to change and terminate the status of aninus. Whereas orlus, as soon as he does one mila, one maisa mila, he's no longer forevermore chayiv in the mitzvah mila. And again, as we said before, orlus is biyadol is sakin, and it's only noig ba'anosh. So the Gemara says hanach nefishin. There are more chumras in orel than there are in onin. Therefore, it's more logical to say the pasuk ish in achilas truma, the Isra achilas truma is coming to be marba orel. That he's included in the Isra achilas truma, and the pasuk called zar is coming to exclude an onain, which is more kal than orel, and he's not included in the Isra achilas truma. Rav Amar below anach nefishin nami lomatzasam. Rav says, I don't need this answer of hanach nefishin, about weighing where the chumra is greater in orel or in onain. Even without that, I'm going to explain why we would prefer to be marba from ish that an oral is included in the Isra achilas truma, and to exclude an onain from the Isra achilas because of a chol zar. Why? Because Omar Kra ish. The Torah is emphasizing the male to the exclusion of the female. What is it that the Torah specifies, singles out as ish? Aninus, we said before, is no heges bein b'noshim. We have no question about the fact that ish is not referring to aninus, because what's the emphasis on the male as opposed to the female? But rather we interpret ish as a ribuy of orel, that an orel is also included like a tame in the Isra achilas truma. Is memela by process of elimination, the pasuk called tar is coming to include only that he's not included in the Isra achilas truma. Now we had in the brisa before that Rabbi Elazar derives the conclusion that Ariel cannot eat truma from Gzeir Shavat Toshav Sachar. Rabbi Kiva, on the other hand, derives the halach that Ariel is excluded from truma from the pasuk ish, which is marba the Ariel, that he has the same status as Ami and he's enjoined from eating truma. Now the Gemara wants to put it back and forth. What does Rabbi Kiva derive from Toshav Sachar, which Rabbi Eliezer uses to derive the conclusion that Ariel is excluded from true. And on the other hand, what does Rabbi Eliezer do with the pasuk each, which Rabbi Akiva used to derive that an Ariel is excluded from true? Rabbi Akiva Hai Toshav V'Sachir in the parasha of Pesach, again, from which Rabbi Eliezer derived that Ariel is excluded from truma. What does Rabbi Akiva Darsh? And after all, he excludes Ariel from truma based on the pasuk ish. Rav Shmaya lasuye arvi mohu v'givoni mohu. That non-Jews, and the Gemara uses the examples of Aravi and Givoni because they apparently had Mila very often. But the Chiddush here is that even though they're mohul physically, biologically, they underwent circumcision, nevertheless they cannot eat the carbon Pesach. So that the Toshav V'Sachir in Pesach is coming to exclude from Achilas HaPesach goyim that had undergone Mila. So the Gemara asks, I don't know if I really need a pasuk. Ahani, this Arvi and Givoni Mohul, Mulim Ninu question mark? Rhetorical question. Are they considered Mulim? I'm going to prove from a mission in the Dorim that they're not considered Mulim, even though physically they underwent Mila, but they're not considered halachically Mulim. So why then do I need a pasuk to include these guys who are Mohul? They're not really Mohul. But tonight we learned in the Dorim, if a person declares Konom Sha'ani Nehene Le'arelim, knows any I know that I would have from Arelim is a Konom. A Konom means it eats neder, miloch and carbon. Is muta be Barele Yisrael, the Osa Bemule, Ovde Kochav. Allowed to be nene from Yisrael, even if they are Arelim. And he's enjoying from benefiting from a Nachri, even if they're Mohul. Or if he declares Konom Sha'ani, that which I benefit from people who are mulim should be a konam, should be like a carbon. Is mutar b'mule ovdei kovim v'aser v'arle Yisrael. He's allowed to benefit from Nachrim, even though they are mahulim. He's enjoyed from benefiting from Yisrael, even if they are arelim. And the reason for this is Nachrim are always considered arelim, even if they're mahulim. So therefore, we conclude here, Pasha, that a Nachri should be excluded from Achil's Pesach, even if they're physically mohul, from the pasuk called Ariel, because they are still considered Arelim. So we don't need a special pasuk and a derivation alfusa from Toshav V'Sachir. No, the Gemara answers, Lasuye ger shemol v'lo toval. So a ger had only Mila and not Tvila, and he's excluded from the carbon pesach. Or another alternative exclusion is Katan Shenolet Mol. He was born Mol. Because Savar and Rabbi Kiva holds that a Katan who's born Mol, Tzarech Lahatif Mimenu Dam Bris, still needs a Mila, which again, how could he have Mila if he has no Orla? But the answer is Hafez Dam Bris. And that's how he enters into Britzot Shel Avram Avinu. Even these did not eat a carbon pesach. Ger until he does tefillah. It's not enough they did mila. And a katan after he has hatofas dam bris. Now the Gemara asks the flip side. Rabbi Eliezer, who derives from Toshav V'Sachir, an exer shav of truma, that an orel is excluded from eating truma, and therefore he cannot derive from this pasuk a ribui of ger shemol v'lo or a katan sheno like shumol that he's excluded from eating the carbon pesach. And the Gemara says l'tamei the omar ger shemol v'lo ger ma'al yehu because savar katan sheno mol and it's sarach lahativ menudam. So Rabbi Eliezer is consistent here. He doesn't need the pasuk of Tosha Sachir to exclude these cases because he holds in these cases Einachinami, they can eat from the carbon. For example, a ger after Mila, even though he has not done Tefillah, he's a ger gomor ma'alya l'chol davar ve'inyan. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, a ger could be miskayer in one of two ways, either through Mila or through Tefillah. One of them is enough, and he's a ger gomor. And the Gemara, back on Daf Mem Vav, brings a source for Rabbi Eliezer. And in the case of Katan, he doesn't need Atofas Tambris. The reason for that is Rabbi Eliezer holds that even though Le'inyan Arla Kvusha, Sheyet Benolad Mohu, Shematimi Arlosa Shrak Arla Vadai Chayeves B'Mila V'lo Arla Safed. So therefore, these categories, according to Rabbi Eliezer, of individuals would actually eat from the carbon pesach. I each my ovidle. Rabbi Akiva used ish to exclude oil from truma, whereas Rabbi Eliezer derived that same din from Tosha V'Sachar. What's he going to do with ish? And the Gemara answers Rabbi Eliezer holds that the double language ish is Dibra Torah Kilosh. You can't do any from that. Because that's the derech b'nei adam, they repeat themselves, to emphasize things, and the Torah speaks the lashon of b'nei adam, and then the Torah didn't have in mind that we should derive any conclusions from ish. Why Rabbi Rav Chama bar Ukva? We're talking about a Kohen Katan Ariel. Notice it's before his 8th day. What's the din? Is it mutter to lasucho b'shemen shel truma or not? And sicha is tishtia, and an orel is excluded from achila or shasiya in truma. Is the katan orel an orel? What are the two tzdadim of the suffix? Arlus, arelus, shelo bizmana, before the chiyuv mila. Notice he's not yet 8 days old. Is it considered orlus akfa, and it passes him from achila and for that matter, like an orel who's awesome? Oh, what should we say? Loma akfa orlus shelo bizmana is not considered orlus, and it doesn't prevent him from eating truma. He's allowed to eat. Was lasuk v'trum shemen shel truma. It's before the 8th day. Now again, the katan, is not doing the action of sicha here. We're doing it on his body. I mean, he's too young to do that. But the iser of truma, in the case of an orel, is also an iser cheft. It's not just the maisa of sicha. It's the chilul kedushas truma when you use it on an orel, or a maisa achila in the case of an orel who eats truma. Rabbi Zera Tashma. We're going to quote a brisa that addresses the issue of milas zecharov v'avodim. As we said earlier, if a person owns avodim, or he has banim zecharim that require mila, and he didn't yet fulfill his mitzvah mila, then he's excluded from achilas hapesach and from truma. And we're going to derive from this brisa that orlus shelo bizmana is considered orlus and excludes him like an orel from eating pesach and from truma. Now, in the pasuk from which we derive the halacha milas zacharav ma'akeves b'korban pesach, which is himol lo kol zachar the uz yikrav lasoso, And then we have a pasuk, which is very similar, that excludes a case of an adon, a rav who owns avodim and has not yet fulfilled his mitzvah meal. He's excluded from Korban Pesach, the adon, because it says v'chol eved ish miknas kesem umalto so oz yochal bo. We have here the word oz in both psukim. We have it in himolo kol zachar, the oz yikrav las. We have it in kol eved ish miknas kesem umalto so oz yochal bo. Ainly el milas zachar b'shas asiya. If you have children, male children, and they are uncircumcised, you have not fulfilled your mitzvah of meal of his your son, and it's the time of Asiyah, which means Shchitas HaPesach. So talking about the 14th of Nisan after Chatzos. And when it says there in the pasuk, the Oz Yikrav Lasoso means Lichchoto. And Umilas Avodov, now we're getting to Avodah before we talk about Zecharav, B'Shas Achila, because it says Oz Yochal Bo. In the pasuk called Eved Ish Miknas Kesem Umaltos. So now we have no source in the pasuk for Milas Zecharav B'Shas Achila, that it's Ma'akiv, or Milas Avodah B'Shas Asiyah. And the Gemara is going to work out the mitzias, but now just in an abstract sense, b'nayin liten es omer shel zeh b'zeh b'somer shel zeh b'zeh, Talmud lomar v'oz l'gzeira shalom. So we have this sort of two-way street, an open highway that connects Milas Zachar and Milas Avodov, and that's the gzeira shalom oz. And from that, we're going to derive that just like in Milas Zecharov, it's Ma'keves Bizman Asiyas HaPesach, means Shchitas HaPesach, so to Milas Avodah, Ma'keves Bizman Shchitas HaPesach. And just like Milas Avodah, Ma'keves Bizman Achilas HaPesach, so to Milas Zecharov, Ma'keves Bizman Achilas HaPesach. Says Reb Zera, again, this is a little bit complicated, because we're trying to prove that Orla Shalom Bizman, even during the 8-day period, within the 8-day period, it's ma'akev as far as achilas, pesach and truma. It has the same orals. So in order to answer that and prove that, we have to ask a question on the Bryce, because the Bryce is assuming that milas avodah and milas zecharov can each have one element shchita before achila or achila without shchita. So from so avodah mishkachas l'disnayu, I could have a case in Mitzius that he has avodim b'shas achila, but less nu b'shas achila. Notice I need a pasuk to be marbe with regard to milas avodov, that even if he didn't have an Eved Oriel at the time of Shchitas HaPesach, but he had an Eved Oriel at the time of Achilas HaPesach, he owned his Avinu Beini Ubeini. It means he purchased an Eved between the Shchita of the Pesach and the Achilas HaPesach. So at the time of Asiyas HaPesach, the Shchita, he did not own an Eved to be Ma'akiv him, but at the time of Achilah, he now owns an Eved, and the Eved is not Mol, and that's going to be Ma'akiv. So I need this pasuk to teach me the case where it was not avodah of arelim ma'akvim b'shas shchita, but rather it was avodah of arelim b'shas achila. But now Zecharov, what's going on in the case of milas Zecharov? The itznahu b'shas achila, the lesnu b'shas achila. We need a pasuk for a case where even though he didn't have a ben Oriel at the time of Shchitas HaPesach, but he had such a ben Oriel at the time of Achilas HaPesach. Hechi mishkachas. I mean, Shchita is on the 14th and Achilas the following night, on the night of the 15th. So how could you have such a thing, b'mitzius? Lavdis yalid. The only possibility would be to have such a mitzius is where he had a son that was born to him between the Asiyah and the Achila. The Asiyah and Achila is a half a day, max. Arlos Shalom Bizman Avi Arlos. That the son that was born before the Achilas HaPesach is an Arel. And it's irrelevant if the father did not have such a son, an Arel, at the time of Shechita, the father will be excluded from Achila because by the time we got to the Zman Achila, he already has a Ben who's an Arel. And how old is this Ben? A few hours old. I mean, he wasn't alive at the time of the Shechita, and he was alive at the time of the Achila. I mean, if you're going to tell me that Orlus Shalom Bizmana is not considered Orlus, then even if he was born before the Achila and he's an Orel, but he's not considered an Orel al Pidin because it's before the 8th day. So why would he be ma'akiv his father from eating from the Korban Pesach? So we have to conclude, therefore, that Orlus Shalom Bizmana is considered Orlus as far as Korban Pesach, and so to Lagabe Achila Truma. So getting back to our case of whether or not you're allowed to anoint a Tinok before his 8th day with Sheven Shel Truma, the answer is no, you're not allowed to do it. And now Rava is going to reject this proof. B'tizbara, if you really believe that this is a foolproof evidence that Orlu Shelo B'zmana Ma'akeves is Oviv Min HaPesach, even if Orlu Shelo B'zmana is considered Orlus, nevertheless, Ein Lomar, we shouldn't say that it would be Ma'akev B'toras Milas Zecharav Havodav. In other words, I'm going to grant you just the opposite conclusion, that Orlus Shelo B'zmana is considered Orlus. I'll grant you that premise, that ruling. But nevertheless, it would not be Ma'akev in the halacha of Milas Zecharav Havodav. Why? Because with regard to Milas Zecharav Havodav, which is Ma'akev in Pesach, it says Himol Lo Kol Zachar and Omrachon, and then it says V'oz Yikrav La Sosa. So from the fact that the Torah writes Himol, it's mashma that the ikuv here is at the time that the ben is already included in the mitzvah of Milah. Himol, and then Oz Yikrav La Sosa. But this katan before his 8th day is Av Bar Mehilahi, who he's not included in the mitzvah of Milah. So you can't say that the mitzias is that he has a ben who's an Orel at the time of Achila, because the ben was born between the Asiyah and the Achila, because he's not considered Himol. He's not included in the mitzvah of Milah. So how can you say Himol? Ella, therefore, says Rava, we have no choice but to explain it in a different way. How is it possible that at the time of the Shechita, he did not have an ikuv because of his ben, but he had such an ikuv at the time of Achila, just a few hours later? Askinon kigon shechalatzatu chamo. At the time of the Asiyas Pesach, his son was very ill. At the time of the Asiyas Pesach, he was already spared. If he was, let's say, suffering from coldness, this little child at the time of Achilas Chama, there was a Chama. I don't think Chama here means the sun. I think it means that his body came back to normal because the warmth of his body, the temperature of his body now became normalized. So he's Nisrape. And now he has the chom of an Adam Bari, and he's Roy Lamila. And on that, the Torah teaches me that he's Ma'akivus of me, Achilas HaPesach. So the Gemara asks the following kash. If you're talking about a case of a Cholish and Isrape, B'nesav le Kol Shiva, why don't we delay Mila for 7 days after he becomes healthy? After, from the moment of the restoration of his health, of his brius, at that point we should be counting 7 days. The halacha is that we have to, when a chola cannot be subject to mila because of the sensitivity of his illness, even after he gets better, we have to wait 7 days until the body is strong enough. And therefore, his mila would not be ma'akev at the time of the achila, because it's not hemo, as before. He's not mehila. The Gemara answers the avina le kol shiva. The case is that he was a chola, then he became a bari. Achein medubar shaya chola vehivri shemona yomim kodem apesach. Him did lo shivas yomim lehibaro. The yom hashmini libaros or erev pesach. So we waited a full 7 days. And the 8th day, which is the day of his Mila, was on Erev Pesach. So the Gemara asks, the Kevan Shekfar Me'aboker Hu Roy Lamu, and because that morning is the already past the 7th day, it's already into the 8th day, is the Mehale Mitzaf. He should have circumcised his son on the morning of the 14th of Nisan, and if he didn't do so, then he's Mu'ukav v'Pesach. And that's already at the time of the Shechita on Erev Pesach. So again, why do we need a pasuk to be marba, a situation in which he was Roy Lamul, he became Roy Mamul only b'shas achila? The Gemara answers, the Inon, I'm going to turn to Daf Alpha, is Me'es Le'es. Note, we don't count 7 calendar days, 1, 2, 3, but we need 7 periods of 24 hours each. And it's not enough to wait until the beginning of the 8th day after 7 days of health pass, but rather he has to wait until 7 full days past. And now we're talking about a case where the hashlama, the completion of the 7 days, from Shah l'Shah, meaning from the moment that he became Bari, that was after the Asiyas HaPesach, meaning the Shechita, but before the Achila. So Mela has a ben who's Roy Lamul only b'shas Achila. And therefore the Pasuk comes to teach me that since he had a ben who was Roy Lamul, Bisman Achilas HaPesach, that's going to be ma'akivim from Achilas HaPesach, even though at the time of the Shechita HaPesach he didn't have a ben who was Roy Lom.